The Echo Chamber, brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers. Sponsored by the Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Echo Chamber. This is Maya Pawinska-Sims, EMEA editor at the Holmes Report, and I'm in a rather damp London today with Richard Shotton, author of The Choice Factory. So this book has been described by Ogilvy's Rory Sutherland as a Haynes Manual for understanding consumer behaviour, and it was published earlier this year, outlining 25 behavioural biases that influence what we as consumers buy and why we do or don't pay attention to brand messages. So loads of pertinent stuff in there for the PR and comms world. Richard, welcome to the Echo Chamber.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Let's start from the beginning. Tell us a bit about your background, when you became interested in behavioural economics and how the book came about.
So my background is as a media planner. Started off as a media planner before moving into research. And I first became interested in behavioural science actually in a very, very specific moment. I think with most things in life, you gradually drift into them. But there was a specific moment I first realised how useful this topic was. And it was stuck in the back of a cab on the way back from what had frankly been a car crash client meeting.
Oh, gosh.
And we'd been with the NHS. We'd been trying to encourage people to give blood. And unfortunately, we were a long way off our targets. And as I went back to the agency, I luckily read about the story of Kitty Genovese. So it's quite a famous story in social psychology, but she was a bar worker in New York. And in 1964, 13th of March, early hours of the morning, she's coming home, parks a car about 100 yards from her house. And then, unfortunately, on the walk to her front door, she's spotted by a man called Winston Moseley. And Moseley stalks her and stabs her. And then within a few days, this is front page news on the front page of the New York Times. And might not sound surprising that such a brutal murder made the front pages, but in 1964 there were 636 other murders, so it's quite rare that a murder would make the front page news. They were unfortunately commonplace at that time in New York. But why this had made the front pages was that supposedly it was witnessed by 37 people.
Right.
And none of them did anything to intervene. So they didn't go down and help, they didn't call the police. And whilst the press was scandalised by this, thinking that it must be a sign of New York's moral decay, that how could a defenceless person be attacked despite there being so many witnesses? Two psychologists heard this story and they thought the Times had come to completely the wrong conclusion. And then it wasn't that no one helped despite there being so many witnesses, it was that no one helped because there were so many witnesses.
Right, OK.
So these two psychologists, Bibb Latané and John Darley, thought that there was a diffusion of responsibility amongst the crowd. So
everyone thought someone else was going to call the police.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And and by the fact that no one else was, or no one else was helping, they thought they judged the situation didn't need any help. Now, rather than just argue this from first principles or from logic alone, the psychologists set up a number of experiments. So they would stage an emergency. For example, one of their colleagues would pretend to have an epileptic fit, and they would set up these emergencies so that either one person saw it or a group of people. And they found that people were twice as likely to come to another person's aid, up to twice as likely, if they were on their own compared to being in a group.
Wow.
So they term this the bystander effect. Simple idea that the more people you ask for help, the less likely any one individual is to help it. So going back to 2004, when I first read this, I thought, bloody hell, this is exactly the problem we face in the blood service. Yeah. We're going out and ask everyone to donate blood. And just as Latané and Darley suggest, most people are ignoring us. So having read that, I thought, well, this is completely applicable to what we're doing. Went and spoke to the creative agency and a lovely strategist down there called Charlie Snow and said, well, why don't we try and apply this? Why don't we try and get around the bystander effect? Stop saying blood stocks are low in England, please donate. Start tailoring the message to not quite individuals, but to locations. So
okay.
Blood stocks low in Birmingham, please donate. Blood stocks low in Brentwood, please donate. Blood stocks low in Basildon, please donate.
And it made a difference?
It made a difference, yeah. So 14 years later, I think it was about 15, here the numbers are a bit fuzzy now, but it was about 15% improvement in the cost per response.
Wow. That's quite an uptick, isn't it?
Quite an uptick from such a... that's by no means a revolutionary tactic. although I think things like IP targeting were a little bit more novel in 2004. But it's a very simple approach. What fascinated me was, up till then, I thought behavioural science or social psychology were irrelevant to advertising. I just thought this was some academic subject, but now saw that it had really practical value to advertising.
And where did you go from it after then? I mean, the book's got an awful lot of academic examples in it from research, which you've summarised beautifully in little kind of nuggets, but you've obviously read widely around this subject now.
Yes. So although it was the bystander effect where I started, that is by no means the only experiment or insight in psychology. There are literally hundreds of biases, hundreds of little quirks of human nature that have been identified by psychologists. So I've spent the last 14 years learning about those, running my own experiments and trying to show brands and marketers and business people in general that this is an immensely practical and relevant topic.
And you've boiled it down to 25 little behavioural biases or tics. How did you come up with the 25 that you think are most relevant to this industry?
Yeah, so it was essentially, as you say, it was the relevance point. So over this period, it was biases that I'd seen or found a use for brands. What I really wanted to do was avoid talking about biases in an abstract sense, because I think there's been quite a lot of work done on that already.
Yeah.
For every bias I identified, I wanted to show that there was a very practical application to pricing or PR or media or marketing in general.
And it's a relatively short book. It's really easy to read, really enjoyable. It's packed with great anecdotes, which I really enjoyed it. There's a lot in there that at first glance looks like it's most relevant to advertising, creatives, planners and marketers. Why would you say the book was relevant for comms and PR professionals as well? I
definitely think it's relevant to comms and PR professionals. I think if you are trying to persuade, if you're the end person trying to persuade is a person, then the study of human nature and why people make the decisions they do is phenomenally relevant. In terms of some of the biases that are most relevant, I think things like the pratfall effect would be of great relevance to PR people.
Tell us about that.
So that is it's from a wonderful study back in 1966 by Elliot Aronson, and it's essentially the idea that people or products who exhibit a flaw become more appealing. So his original study, he recruited a colleague of his to take part in a quiz. He gave his colleague all the answers. So the colleague does amazingly well, gets 92% of the questions right, wins the quiz by miles. But then as he is standing up at the end of the quiz, as the quiz comes to the end, he makes what an American would call an Americanism, a pratfall, a small blunder.
Right.
He spills a cup of coffee down himself. So Aronson has recorded all of this, and then he takes that recording, he plays it to people, and he either plays the entire incident,
including the spill.
Yeah, spill and great performance, or just the great performance. And then he goes and asks people, how appealing do you find the contestant? And people find the contestant significantly more appealing, statistically significantly more appealing, if they have heard the mistake as well as the great performance.
And why is that? Is it just about him appearing more human?
So I think on a personal level, Aronson argued it was a kind of a humanising factor. What's interesting is I think it also works for brands as well, and I think there are additional reasons why it's so effective for brands.
Okay, tell us about those.
So when I say it works for brands, if you think about some of the most successful ad campaigns of all time, Stella, really short and expensive, admits it's expensive. VW went out and said it was ugly. Listerine, the taste shake twice a day, admitted it was horrible tasting. Why I think those kind of approaches are really successful is they understand the position that the listener's coming from. They understand that the listener or the audience doesn't trust an advertiser. They're suspicious of the claims. They think they're either partial at best or maybe lies at worst. And therefore, by admitting a weakness, you've given a tangible demonstration of your honesty, and therefore all your other claims become that much more believable.
It seems really kind of common sense, really, doesn't it? But I'm guessing that most people in the business we're in don't actually know that much about all this, kind of the wealth of stuff they can learn from behavioural science. Do you think that there's a I mean, you've obviously summarised a lot of it, but do you think it's a discipline that more marketers and PR people should get more of a handle on?
So absolutely. I think two really interesting bits of that question. The first is it common sense? And the interesting thing with that pratfall effect is there's a phenomenal amount of evidence for it. So there's the Aronson evidence, there's lots of case study evidence, there's more recent evidence, Northwestern University, that it works in the real world. So they've shown, for example, that reviews online, the better the review gets, so like the better the score is out of 5 or 10, the more likely people are to purchase that product, until you reach a tipping point where if the review gets any better, likely to purchase declines.
Wow,
so they argue that perfection is too good to be true. So it's a bias, it's an insight that's been found again and again and again. Yet, if you flip it, and rather than just list off some of the great campaigns that have used it, and instead look at a selection of newspapers, which I've done, you find that less than 1% of advertisers use it. It's the tiniest of amounts. So once we're aware of it, it might be explicable, and there's lots of evidence for it, it's still being massively underused by advertisers.
Right.
So I wouldn't want people to think, oh, this stuff is common sense, everyone's doing it, therefore I have no opportunity. There is still plenty of competitive advantage people can get from applying these biases.
And there's an awful lot of stuff in here that's kind of counterintuitive as well. It's like it's the opposite of what we believe to be true.
Yeah.
And actually it's been proven again and again.
Yes.
You've got examples throughout the book. Give an example of something that surprised you when you first found out about it.
Well, pratfall effect was certainly that. I'll do another as well. But the pratfall effect was that. If you think most advertisers, they go out, or most PR claims are just telling people how amazing they are. Fascinatingly, this shows you that's actually a counterproductive approach. One of the other bits that I thought was fascinating, because at first it just sounds like hokum, was there is an Adam Alter study. He's a psychologist at NYU. And what he found was this idea called 9 enders.
Right, okay.
So it's the idea that people are particularly likely to make massive life decisions when their age ends in 9.
Right,
so he calls them 9 enders, they're aged 29, 39, 49. And it sounds like rubbish at first, because how he first gives evidence is a bit shaky. He goes out, uses a giant global study, and it's along the lines of, have you made a massive life decision in the last 12 months? People are much more likely to agree if their age ends in 9. Now, that's a bit shaky, because one of the core findings of social psychology is what people say motivates them is very different from what actually does.
Yes.
But then what he does, and I think this is the best, this is the hallmark of the best academics and best psychologists, is he then finds an amazing range of different data sources that kind of prove his point. So he looks at something called Athlinks, which is an athletics website, and finds that people are significantly more likely to do their first marathon. I think it's 48% more likely when their age ends in 9. 48% more likely.
Wow.
Then he looks at a little bit more depressing data, Ashley Madison data. So this is the Affairs website.
Yes.
Cheery slogan, life is what happened affair. And then again, 9 enders, I think 19% more likely to register when their age ends in 9. Even, most seriously of all, US suicide data, there's a statistically significant, albeit small, uplift in suicides when someone's age ends in 9.
Gosh.
So he doesn't just take what people say at face value. He finds all these other different data sources and shows that it's a genuine, valid finding. And then once advertisers know that, or businesses know that, if you are trying to sell a sports car or a diet brand or long-haul holidays, targeting people when their age ends in 9 is a brilliant opportunity. And best of all, it's probably one that your competitors don't know about, so you've got an opportunity to steal a march on them.
The crisis of the 9 enders.
Yes, yeah.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
I've been through about one more than I would like to be through thus far. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the biases. Let's start at the beginning with bias number 1, the fundamental attribution error. Outline this for me and why target contexts are as important as target audiences, which hadn't occurred to me before.
Okay. So the fundamental attribution error is the idea that when we're explaining behaviour, we put too much emphasis on someone's character and not enough on the situation.
Right.
And the most famous experiment around this area was one by John Darley and Batson. And I think this shows its age a bit. It was 1973, so they were working with 40-odd trainee priests. And like all psychology experiments, they had invented a cover story. So they never tell people why they're taking part in this experiment. And they told them that it was about they wanted to watch them give a presentation, a sermon. They wanted to watch them give a sermon. And they briefed them in a hall, and then they were going to send them on their way, 5-minute walk to the local church. As they are leaving, and this is the crux of the experiment, they either say, oh gosh, you're a little bit late, you better hurry, or, okay, you've got loads of time, but you'll probably get there a bit early, but don't worry about it, might as well head off now. Then when they're walking to the church, the psychologists have made sure there's one of their colleagues is pretending to be ill, on leaning down against the wall, looking pale and sickly and troubled. And the real part of the experiment was how many of these trainee priests would stop and help. And what's interesting is when they're in a rush, 10% stopped. When they were told they had plenty of time, 63% stopped. Now that's the importance of the situation. The other part of this insight is people repeatedly and regularly underestimate that situational importance. So if you go and ask people, how much of an effect do you think the rush would have? They think it's tiny. What people think would have an effect is the personality, the kind of altruism of the audience.
But they're all priests, so that's quite a good, sample, because you're assuming they're all altruistic, and they would all be good Samaritans.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think in fact the just for kind of irony, I think the sermon they were meant to be talking about was the Good Samaritan as well.
It's perfect. Just to rub it in.
Yes, and Darley and Batson also asked those people. I think they had to do a kind of a personality questionnaire, and there were various different reasons they give for going into the priesthood. Some of which was about the glory of God. Others was to help other people. Now, the helping other people was the part they were interested in, and whether or not they agree with that statement strongly or not at all, it had minimal effect on whether they stopped.
So how does that, what can brands who are trying to reach consumers with their messages learn from that example?
Well, the key thing is marketers and brands spend an inordinate amount of time talking about, okay, who's the ideal target audience? What social psychology would suggest is, yes, that's important to a degree, but actually you should be far more broader in your targeting and think more about the target context. So
it's not just about Karen from Staines and two kids. It's about what Karen's doing in her day.
Has Karen just got paid? If she's just got paid, she'll be spending far more on discretionary items than if she hasn't. Is she in a good mood? If she's in a good mood, there's evidence from Fred Bronner that she's more likely to notice that than if she's in a bad mood. The literal interpretation from the Darley and Batson experiment would be, is she in a rush? If she is, she's unlikely to notice.
So not even noticed. It's not a question of rejecting a brand message in whichever format it comes. It's actually literally just not penetrating.
Yes. So now this is going back. So I think when Darley and Batson went and questioned the priest at the end, I think there was an element of, even if they had physically seen the person, they hadn't even kind of gone far enough to think. There wasn't like a literal debate of should they donate. So
there was no engagement with that at all.
Because they kind of, I've forgotten the guy's name, but I think they called it a narrowing of the cognitive map. Okay. They become there was tunnel vision almost.
So even if you've got your demographics completely spot on, you've got your human insights completely spot on, all based on data, you could just literally be reaching that perfect audience at completely the wrong time.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's really interesting.
There's another element of this which becomes, even if there was no improvement in the performance of reaching someone at that stage, just doing something different from your competitors has a big value in a world where media buying has become increasingly auction-driven. If you go and target ABC Ones or 1634s like everyone else, well, you're in a very busy, very competitive auction. What you really want to be doing is targeting a C2 person when they've just got paid, or a 45-year-old who's just undergone a life event and therefore their habits have become destabilised.
Tell us about that, the stuff about life events completely changing the way people see brands and the world around them.
So there's an idea that we buy an awful lot of our behaviour is habitually driven.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. You've got so many.
We just do the same things.
Yeah.
We buy the same stuff. We do the same things every day.
It's a way of navigating a world of huge choice. Just buying the same things last time is an easy way to not bother making a decision, really. A colleague and I, Laura Weston, put a very simple study together to try and understand when people's habits were at their weakest, when they were most open to trying new things. And all we did was a 2-question survey. So the first question is, have you undergone any of these life events in the last 6 or 12 months? And when by life event, I mean things like, have you been married, divorced, retired, moved house, started a new job, a few others. Then we asked them a few filler questions just to throw them off the scent. And then the final question was, and we did a few different variations, but it was things like, tick the categories where you have tried a new brand, got a new favourite, or started buying one more regularly. And for every life event, you see people are between 2 and 3 times more likely to have tried a new brand or got a new favourite in that 6-12 month window after there's been a life event compared to the kind of population as a whole.
So something huge happening just throws all your habits up in the air.
Yes. I mean,
buying habits included.
There's probably two reasons. One, I think exactly as you put it, if someone's environment becomes destabilised, then they at least become open to. They've got to at least consider what they're doing, and therefore they're open to change. I mean, the second area there's another secondary fascinating explanation, which is, I think most people frankly don't give 2 hoots about brands. They have a kind of a slight warmth to them. This idea of loyalty and love is massively overblown. So let's take an example of moving house and coffee shops. If you were a Caffè Nero buyer, you move house and now Caffè Nero is a little bit awkward. It's like a mile's walk. Very few people are going to bother trudging through the rain to get to Caffè Nero. Suddenly you're in the market and the Pret and the Starbucks are only a couple hundred yards away. You're now in the market and you're going to be choosing between one of those 2 brands. So that's the time when advertising can sway you more
just
effectively.
kind of get in there quickly. Tell me a bit about, I'm going to skip forward to bias number 12, confirmation bias. Now, I thought this was an interesting theory. This is who to target, who to try and sell to, effectively. And the theory here is the triage approach, where marketers should focus on those consumers where comms is likely to have an effect, rather than those who already know they love or loathe the brand.
Yes.
My question there is, because we talk a lot in PR and comms about advocates, about influencers, about word of mouth. Leveraging those already fans, is that an invalid tactic, or are you going to have more business impact by always going for the ones who don't know yet? Yes.
So I wouldn't argue it's an invalid tactic, but I wonder if it's one we might exaggerate the effect of.
Right, okay. Bad news for everyone with influencer relations.
This is, now I might be moving to kind of speculation slightly, but it's getting to this idea of, of course there are some fans of brands, but not that many.
Yeah.
If we're honest, the role of a brand in most people's life is far less meaningful. So the scale is always going to be on the side of moving people who have a slight warmth to buying a little bit more regularly, or are neutral towards a brand being slightly positive. I do think it's fascinating, and I wonder if this comes into ideas of sometimes the decisions we make are more about for our own personal benefit than the brand itself.
Right.
And I wonder if we sometimes subscribe to this idea or overemphasise the importance of fans because it makes us feel more powerful and more influential, rather than the less dramatic approach of targeting the mildly interested.
So that kind of the holy grail of real emotional engagement with a brand is probably not all it's cracked up to.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are there's a lot of work done by Ben Anfield about the importance of emotion in advertising, and I wouldn't certainly disagree with that. I think one of the findings from behavioural science is that people do not weigh up all the logic and the reasons and the rationality for buying a brand. I mean, people aren't standing at the deodorant counter for hours
reading the back of the packets.
Weighing up the carbon footprint and the cost per spray. A warm feeling towards a brand will have it is hugely valuable. It's just when we go from warm feeling, positive disposition, and positive associations to love marks and loyalty and fandom. I think it's the leap that's the problem.
Yeah.
The exaggeration, not trying to deny the role of emotion.
And just not attainable for most brands in the market, really. Yeah. Which are just part of our day-to-day lives rather than necessarily completely kind of aspirational. You don't have to be in love with a brand. You heard it here first. Bias 14 is another interesting one, wishful seeing, which covers a topic very close to the hearts of the PR industry at the moment, brand purpose. And I don't think I've had a conversation in the last 3 months that hasn't included the words brand purpose. Somewhat controversially, you essentially debunk the business benefits of brand purpose in this chapter, or the research that led to everybody jumping on the brand purpose bandwagon. Talk us through the reasoning there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, because often people justify brand purpose by case studies. They'll look at Patagonia or...
that comes up a lot. There's always a Patagonia slide at a conference.
Yes, yeah. And, I don't know enough about Patagonia, but I'm sure, phenomenal campaigns, and that may well have a brand purpose and done very well out of it. But there are, tens or hundreds of thousands of brands in the world. So picking the odd case study doesn't really prove or disprove something. So I think if you're going to argue the toss over brand purpose, you need to have a look at some broader research. And the most quoted broader research that tries to draw general themes is Stengel's research in the book Grow.
Yeah.
So this is the one that I think Martin Sorrell said was utterly convincing.
Yeah.
Tom Peters said it was a landmark.
Gets waved around a lot.
Gets waved around a lot. And then the main chart that I certainly see again and again in presentations is the Stengel 50. So he works with Mill Brown, takes the top 50 brands in their 50,000 strong database and shows that they grow at 383% over that period, their share price. Whereas in comparison, the Standard & Poor index dropped by 7%.
Right.
And then what Stengel had already done was look at those top 50 brands, and he had supposedly found a link between the brands, which was brand purpose. So that chart is often used as the argument that if you have a brand purpose, a kind of higher order ideal, often interpreted as a kind of an ethical communications and such, then your stock market will grow stratospherically. I looked into all the footnotes that he provides, and to be absolutely fair to him, and I probably may not say this enough, he's very good in that actually he puts his working and his methodology out openly. Most people don't do that, so a lot of respect for him in that area. But by doing it, you could see all the issues with this study as well, from the accuracy of the data. A lot of the brands that he uses don't actually have stock market prices. So about a third of the brands he looks at are just smaller entities within large holding companies.
Right, okay.
So, for example, he says, Innocent Smoothies has a brand ideal. We know it works because of the Coca-Cola stock market price moving upwards. The problem with that is what he's claiming and the metric he's using are proving different things. So Innocent's less than, or about 1% of Coca-Cola's turnover. Can't possibly be responsible for this huge organisation's turnover increase and stock market performance. So about a third of the data is, unfortunately, polluted, which should stop us using it. And it is an even bigger problem. There's a logical problem behind it, which is Stengel takes the top 50 brands out of Mill Brown's 50,000. So this is the cream of the cream in terms of brands, the top 0.1%. And then says this group of brands have had a great stock market performance. Well, the problem with that is what he's essentially saying is brands that do amazingly well on Mill Brown's loyalty and bonding scores have performed well previously. They've got a good stock market price.
Yeah.
And that's kind of circular logic.
It's very circular.
It's basically saying, very successful brands have had a good stock market
Successful
performance.
brands are successful.
Yes.
Yeah. So why is everyone so passionate about brand purpose at the moment? Is it just to make our slick better as an industry?
I think so. There are other, we have more time to go to some of the other problems of the data, but I think those two are illustrative. I think there's probably two areas. There's one which is this idea, I call it wishful seeing, that we see what we want to see. And I think a slight shame of marketing and selling has crept into the industry that, from my point of view, it should be enough. We're doing a great job if you make people believe a soft drink tastes that much nicer. You're doing a great job if you create an amazing brand that gives people confidence when they walk into a room. Those are noble and decent ideals. But I think there's crept into marketing recently a bit of a shame about selling. And because of that, we've looked to more grandiose justifications for our job. And I think that is what brand purpose.
So brands that make a difference in the world make us feel like we're making a difference in the world as marketers and
you can
PR
go
professionals.
You can have
a really interesting argument, actually.
Dinner party and feel proud because you can go and say you're saving the world.
I'm making a difference. I'm saving the planet. Yeah. Not just selling stuff.
Yes.
That's really interesting. Controversial.
But the second bit on that is, and I think this might be typical of more the studies, is I do worry that one of the changes in the last 10, 15 years, we've all got access to a lot more data. I don't think anyone would dispute that. But the problem with having access to more data is we have a fixed amount of hours in the day. So by definition, the amount of time we're spending analysing each bit of data decreases. So I wonder if more and more often we accept the headline finding of reports and research, even if the methodology and the data and the mechanics behind it don't support it, because people feel they're too busy to go and pour through the detail.
Which brings us back to the point that it's important to get much more of a handle on behavioural science and
Absolutely.
not just
Yes.
accept the headline.
Yes.
You talked about, and you referred to this a couple of times earlier, you haven't just pulled together existing academic research, you've also conducted experiments of your own that you referred to throughout the book. What was your favourite or most surprising experiment?
I think my favourite was probably we were working with a clothes brand, New Look, and they were going to launch or starting to promote their menswear range. And they had a very small budget for this, and we had a feeling that the kind of initial approach was just going to announce that we have men's clothes wasn't the right one. So wanted to try and test whether there was a better way of doing it, if there were problems with just an announcement approach.
And they're just a high street women's wear brand up until this point.
Yes, absolutely. So when I spoke to the planners and raised some of my concerns, this was internally in the agency, and they were adamant that we haven't got any budget. Clients are not going to pay for you to come and tell them something they don't want to hear. So couldn't do any large-scale research. So what I did instead was recruit half a dozen people from around the agency. Took 2 photos of them, one holding a plastic shopping bag emblazoned with the New Look logo, and then the other exactly the same person, exactly the same pose, but holding a Topman bag.
Were they all guys?
All blokes. So then we put those photos onto a dating site called Badoo, or what had been called Hot or Not. And the interesting thing about that website was people would put their photos up and everyone else would then rate how good looking they were. So we put all these photos up, and then 2 weeks later I went back and looked at the results. And when men were holding a New Look bag, they were seen as 20 to 25% less sexy than when they were holding a Topman bag.
Wow. So the exact same guy.
Exact same guy, same pose, just different bag.
Ouch.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So the argument again to the team was, look, this is not just an announcement job. There's a far bigger task. You need not just to tell people you have men's clothes because there's a slightly problematic image. You need to persuade people that it doesn't matter shopping about at a company that once was a female-only shop, or just get people thinking of you as a unisex shop. But a bigger task with a far bigger budget was required.
That's really interesting. Did they take that on the chin? Did they even sell menswear now?
Oh, yeah, they still sell menswear. Yeah, so I can't remember if the budget went up.
It's been a while since I've been into New Look.
Yes.
That's really interesting. So tell me one thing you'd like our listeners who are PR and comms people globally to take away from the book, assuming that you must all go out and buy it. Obviously,
Yes.
That's definitely the thing. What's one thing you'd like them to take away from this?
So well, I think we've touched on one, which is the big bit of don't be shy of admitting a flaw.
Yeah.
I think we default to trying to claim we're perfect. That is, I think, a very powerful tactic. The other, which might be of interest, is this idea called the peak end rule. So if you're ever responsible for a kind of customer experience, there's an argument and a lot of experiments behind it from Kahneman and Radelmeyer that when people think back to the experience you've created, they cannot remember everything. You know, if you try to remember all of our past would be would have a deluge of information, just overwhelm us. And instead, people put disproportionate influence on the peak moment of that experience and the final moment of that experience.
Right. So peak being
the most emotionally powerful moment, either the best or the worst. So suddenly, if you're creating a customer experience, you shouldn't just be thinking about doing everything a little bit better. You should be thinking about one moment of excellence and ideally what happens at the very end of that experience. You know, whether it's as someone leaves a store or your stand or whatever, you know, that gets off a plane. It's the final moment of the experience that is disproportionately important.
Yeah, and that lingers. That's really interesting. Yes. So what's next for you? You spent 14 years summing up behavioural psychology and how it applies to marketing.
The next book's out in 2032. Yeah.
Well, are you working on something else?
I am. So two big things. I'm working on a second book.
Yeah.
That has slightly slowed down because it's taking an awful long time to promote the first one. But I'm working on a second book, which will be another collection of biases and also maybe a framework for applying them.
Okay.
Because I think if you have too many, if you're aware of too many biases, they can become a bit confusing. So therefore, we'll try and develop a framework to help people apply them. And the second bit, what I've done is also set up a company called Astro 10, which helps brands apply some of these findings.
Okay, cool. Well, I will look forward to reading the next
Excellent.
one in another 14 years.
Yeah. No, probably 2020.
2020, okay. Rich, thank you so much for joining us in the Echo Chamber today. Cheers.
You've been listening to The Echo Chamber. Brought to you by The Holmes Report and produced by Marketeers. Sponsored by The Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.